Hello, BookTube. I have some more new arrivals to show you. No package opening, but still, we've got some books to show you here. Starting with a book you may have seen on Britta Bowler's channel. She does a TBR for the upcoming month, and she did one for January, and this was one of the books that she mentioned, and it was sort of on my radar too, and seeing it on her channel, knowing that it piqued her interest, naturally made it extra pique mine. So I'm going to give it a try. This is, I believe, a debut novel by Megan Angelo called Followers. Let's see what we have here. Orla Cadden is a budding novelist stuck in a dead-end job writing clickbait articles about movie star hookups and influencer yoga moves. Then Orla meets Floss, a striving wannabe A-lister who comes up with a plan for launching them both into the high-profile lives they dream about. So what if Orla and Floss's methods are a little shady and sometimes people get hurt? Their legions of followers can't be wrong. 35 years later, in a closed California village where government-appointed celebrities live every moment of the day on camera, a woman named Marlo discovers a shattering secret about her past. Despite her massive popularity, 12 million loyal followers, Marlo dreams of fleeing the corporate sponsors who would do anything to keep her on screen. When she learns that her whole family history is based on a lie, Marlo finally summons the courage to run in search of the truth, no matter the risks. Is this a debut novel? I believe that it is. Let's see. Megan Angelo grew up in Quakertown, Pennsylvania, and graduated from Villanova University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Glamour, and Elle. Good for her. Wow. Among other publications. She lives in Pennsylvania with her family, and this is indeed her first novel. Okay. And this splits, the narrative here splits its paths between the present day and 2051 and 50 years from now. And the gap between those two things, we follow our two main characters when they're young and just starting out, and then we also follow them in much later in a different world. And the gap between them is characterized by a cataclysmic event, a cataclysmic thing, a cataclysmic realization that changes the world, it changes everything, and it involves your cell phone. The event involves your cell phone. And it is a little bit silly, it's a little bit melodramatic, as all such events are, but I'm looking forward to reading this. I love debut fiction anyway. I was a little confused at first when I saw it on Britta's channel about whether or not this is classified as YA. It turns out that it's not, so we'll see if it actually is YA, whether it's classified that way or not. Something about it, some of the elements strike me as YA-ish, but that there's going to be some bleed through there anyway, so that might not be anything. This next one is also, I believe, a debut novel. Yes? Let's see. Yes, this is also a debut novel. So we have two debut novels in these new arrivals. This is also, like Followers, this is a January release, I believe. Yeah, this comes out in late January. And we might have already seen it. This is the finished copy of Andrew David MacDonald's When We Were Vikings. But here you can see that the cover is really pretty. The cover has the gold gilt and everything. And this is, let's see here. In When We Were Vikings, Zelda, who's 21 years old, is on the fetal alcohol spectrum. As a result, she sees the world a bit differently, and until now, other people have managed her life. Her father left the family years ago, and her mother has died, so Zelda now lives with her older brother, Gert. For Zelda, life is best lived with some basic rules. Rule number 1, a smile means thank you for doing something that I liked. Rule number 2 means fist bumps and dabs equal respect. Rule number 3, strange people are not appreciated in her home. Rule number 4, tomatoes must go in the middle of a sandwich and not get the bread wet. And rule number 5, sometimes the most important things don't fit on lists. But when Zelda, a Viking enthusiast, finds out that Gert has resorted to some questionable and dangerous methods to make enough money to keep them afloat, she decides to take matters into her own hands. Zelda knows Viking women were also fierce warriors, so she decides to launch her own quest, one that will find her autonomy and independence in a world that refuses to see her as an adult. And once again, I have the same question about whether or not this is actually YA, whether or not the author wrote it that way and maybe pitched it that way and then was told or thought or was advised by an agent or whoever to maybe pitch it as an adult novel. That does happen, and it worries me. It worries me. The telltale signs here: the protagonist is an adult, but has a mitigating reason in the plot to both be treated like a child by everyone around her and to act like a child. Also, novels that revolve around lists, cutesy-poo lists, that's a staple of YA fiction. But we shall see. We shall see. And the author, Andrew David MacDonald, grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. God help us all. He won a Western Magazine Award for Fiction, was shortlisted for the Canadian National Magazine Award for Fiction, and his work has been anthologized in 4 volumes of Journey Prize stories, collecting the year's best Canadian stories for emerging writers. He has an MFA from the Program for Poets and Writers at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Good Lord. Have we sunken so low that we're taking people from Edmonton? Anyway, that's another debut. Then we'll move on to nonfiction. This one, I have a couple of rants about it, but I'm going to keep them. I'm going to keep them nice and controlled. I think we saw this already. This is the finished copy, also a January release. Yes? No, February, early February. This is a finished copy of Diana Preston's 8 Days at Yalta, a new book about the Yalta conference between the big three, timed for the 75th anniversary of the historic Yalta conference. Good Lord. While some of the last battles of World War II were being fought, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met on February 4th to 11th in 1945 in the Crimean resort town of Yalta. Over 8 days of bargaining, bombast, and intermittent bonhomie, while Soviet soldiers and NKVD men patrolled the grounds of the 3 palaces occupied by their delegations, they decided, among other things, on the end game of the war against Nazi Germany and how a defeated and occupied Germany should be governed, on the constitution of the nascent United Nations, and on the price of Soviet entry into the war against Japan, and a bunch of other stuff. And this will be a new examination of this. I'm hoping that it's not cringing and apologetic. Most of the books that I have read on Yalta have had a subtone of cringing apologia towards the Soviet Union, towards the Russians. When I am sure that I am not alone, or maybe wasn't alone half a century ago, in saying that the main thing that Roosevelt and Churchill should have done at Yalta was declare war on Stalin. Instead, they just sat there while he made more and more and more demands. This dictator who was worse than Hitler, this guy who had blood seeped into his every pore and molecule, and he's at the table dictating terms about how much of Europe he wants, with a paper-thin economy and a military stretched to the breaking point. The Western powers could have crushed him, or at least brought him to heel. And they didn't do it. They didn't do anything like that. And that's well, I'll have to see the tone that Preston takes in this book. I'll have to see whether or not she is willing to look at Stalin straight on, instead of the false equivalence that writers about Yalta so often buy into, even when they say they're not. They so often buy into the false equivalence that this you've got these three, the big three, these 3 big guys, they all must be roughly similar. They're not. They're not roughly similar at all. They're 2 great statesmen and the horrible monster who was the price of doing business. That's not the same. Those 3 things are not the same. So we'll have to see about that. One small sentence level rant that I might work into a review of this book will be to ask what the hell is going on this cover. What the hell is going on this cover? Franklin Delano Roosevelt had not been able to do what he's doing on this cover. In 1945, he had not been able to do that in roughly 40 years. That's absurd. Just absurd. Why not give Churchill a skin-tight black t-shirt and bulging pecs? While you're at it, why not do that? What is hurt in the checkerboard symmetry of this cover by putting Roosevelt in a wheelchair? What is hurt by that? And certainly nowhere near as hurt as this. Oh, what is that? Did he sprain his ankle while playing tennis right before Yalta? Is that what happened? Anyway, this comes out in early February, so I'm not probably going to get to it right away. I will probably leave it a bit until late January or early February. And then this next one comes out in April, and yet asymmetrically. I will probably read it right away. This is by Sai Krishna Bangalore Prakesh, and this is The Living Presidency. And this is an argument for reducing the powers, reining in the power of the executive. Let's see here. Liberal scholars and politicians routinely denounce the imperial presidency, a self-aggrandizing executive that has progressively sidelined Congress. Yet the same people invariably extol the virtues of a living constitution, whose meaning adapts with the times. Prakash argues that these stances are fundamentally incompatible. A constitution prone to informal amendment systematically favors the executive and ensures that there are no enduring constraints on executive power. In this careful study, Prakash contends that an originalist interpretation of the Constitution can rein in the living presidency legitimated by the living Constitution. Though often associated with conservative goals, originalism in Prakash's argument should appeal to Republicans and Democrats alike, as almost all Americans decry the presidency's stunning expansion. The living presidency proposes a baker's dozen of reforms, all of which could be enacted if only Congress asserted its lawful authority. Obviously very present in the news today. in the news this week, this is very present, where you have members of the Republican Senate in America, a few of them anyway, actually going on camera willing to say, well, it's not just that we should be consulted before the president declares war, it's that he can't do that without us. He can't just consult us. He needs our permission. He needs our authorization to do that. If we're going to go on endlessly banging the drum about how a Democratic president is flouting the law to make any kind of unilateral military decision without authority of Congress for an authorization of force, then we have to do the same thing when it's a Republican president. The fundamental flaw in the thinking here that has allowed the imperial presidency to grow is when the imperial presidency is, as it is right now, backed by a senatorial majority. And the fundamental flaw in the thinking that allows that to happen is the senatorial majority thinking that as long as the president's on their team, any amount of power that they give him only helps them. When that is not true. And it'd be nice if more senators recognized that, no matter who's in power. There are three branches of government. The president is not on the team of the legislative. The legislative is on a different team. The president's on his own team. The more power you give him, the more power his team is going to have. And the less power your team's going to have. And Prakash is, we'll have to see, I'll have to read this right away and find out, but the statement on the back cover is correct, which is that the Constitution allows for the reining in of the presidency, the reining in of the executive. The legislative branch has an enormous amount of power that it has been slowly ceding to the executive for years on that mistaken assumption. It's always the majority that cedes that power to a like majority, a like party president. And then wants it back when all of a sudden there's a mismatch, when the majority power in the Senate is not the same party as the president. Then all of a sudden they want those powers back. Well, the key is not to cede them. The key is to treat the executive as the opposing team. But anyway, I'm always in favor of presidential analyses and stuff like that, so I will read that. This next one is from Smith Publicity. I don't actually know this publisher. It's a mid-January thing. It seemed very interesting to me. Theological work, so those of you who are Christians, maybe like reading about Christianity, will want to perk up your ears. This is by Jared Wilson, and it's called The Gospel According to Satan. 8 lies about God that sound like the truth. There are phrases we have heard time and again, especially in Christian circles, that are well-meaning yet may be causing more harm than good. Phrases like, God just wants you to be happy, or live your truth, or let go and let God. Some of these are catchy sayings, are repeated so often, even within the church, that people think they're actually from the Bible. But how do we know how to separate truth from lies? Lies that may seem good, well-intentioned, but are often causing more harm than good. Jared Wilson, a renowned author of more than 15 books and professor at Spurgeon College, is tackling this issue head on in his new book. One of the best tricks of the devil, this is a quote, one of the best tricks of the devil is getting you to think his ideas aren't just yours, but God's, Wilson explains. So he creates his own gospel, a perversion of the real one. It appears good because it appeals to answers, okay. Satan is clearly at work in this pub sheet. It appears to answer questions, satisfy our desires, and solve mysteries we have always pondered. But if you unpack these common beliefs and hold them up next to the actual scripture in the Bible, it tells a far different story. For instance, the most common lies of the devil today, how to recognize them and how to arm yourself against them with the truth of Christ. This is one of the things the book promises to do. Why Christians are not immune to the lies of the devil and how to anchor themselves to the truth. Of course, Christians are not only not immune, but the only ones who are susceptible, right? Hindus aren't susceptible to the lies of Satan. Gospel-centered faith. The subtle Oprahization of Christian faith, how to recognize it and how to handle it. So I'll be sincerely hoping that this book, it's not a big thing, I'll read it in an hour. I'll be sincerely hoping that it takes a couple of swipes. That mention of Oprahization makes me hopeful. I'm hoping that it will take a couple of swipes at the prosperity gospel as well, which is massively popular in the United States, just massively popular. It is Christianity for a huge number of fundamentalist Christians all throughout this country, and it is heresy. It is, to use Jared Wilson's very clever framing of things, it is the work of the devil. Explicitly so. As I've said on this channel a couple of times, and as I've mentioned in my Sunday school class quite often, Jesus Christ in the four Gospels is not explicit about a whole lot of things. There are a whole lot of things that we really wish he'd been more explicit about. But one of the things that he was unbelievably explicit about was the relationship of Christians to money, to excessive wealth. He was unbelievably explicit about that. Go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and come and follow me, and you will have eternal life. It's just one example among 4 or 5 things that he himself was a poor man and was surrounded all day long every day by poor people. And he had an animosity against the rich. It's clear in the Gospels. You can see it plain as day. And it wasn't just a personal thing. It wasn't a social thing. It was also a religious thing. No man can serve 2 masters. So what is the important thing in your life here? To give to everyone who asks you? To turn the other cheek? To give the cloak as well? Or to amass money? To amass riches on earth? Which is your master? Which is the most important thing? I would say that, I haven't read this book yet, I'll read it today, but for me, that is, to use Jared Wilson's idea, that is the primary teaching of Satan in the guise of Christianity, is making a golden calf out of wealth and the accumulation of massive amounts of wealth, so that you have prosperity gospel preachers bragging to their congregations on camera about how they have a different Rolex for every day of the week, or about how God wanted them to have that jet stream. Anyway, I thought that was really interesting. That a lot of the pat reductions, the reductionisms of Christianity, might actually be working against Christianity. That's interesting. So I'll be gobbling that up. I'm sorry. Oh my. Oh God. This is pure coincidence. I did not mean to put these two together. And it's not as much of a conflict as it seems. I was just mentioning fundamentalist Christianity in America. Fundamentalist Christianity in America is a weird outlier of Christianity in most of the rest of the world. So this isn't really as much of a conflict as it might seem. Most Christians are open and loving. They know perfectly well that they have been enjoined by their Savior to be open and loving. Nevertheless, right next to the book about the gospel according to Satan is Richie Jackson's book, Gay Like Me. We've got the sun playing tricks here. Here, I wonder if I can control that. Can I control that a bit? Look at that. Oh, wow. I got these technologies down pat. This is Gay Like Me. The subtitle is A Father Writes to His Son. Another tiny thing. Take no time at all to read. This comes out at the end of January. Is an eye-opening indictment of straight lash in America. I don't know what that is. What is straight lash? Award-winning film, television, and Broadway producer Richie Jackson shares a poignant love letter to his gay son, reflecting on his 50 years as a gay man in America. Jackson has written a vitally important book that will open many people's eyes to the reality of what it means to be gay in America today. At once a celebration of gay identity and culture, a much-needed example of how to parent gay children, and a rallying cry for the LGBTQ community to avoid complacency and bigotry, I would assume. These letters are us, and if you're not one of these letters, you're not us. The sooner we get rid of it, the better. It is also an illuminating personal reflection that will move readers alike in all walks of life. Earnestly and beautifully written, Gay Like Me is an indispensable resource for young people and parents, particularly those whose children identify as LGBTQ. And I believe it's LGBTQI++. Utterly ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. You have to go through an eye examination chart just to name what you are in the world. Anyway. So that is father and son right there. And it's a slim thing, but it has tons and tons of blurbs, and it has the feeling to me of a book that is probably going to outlive its day. I will give it a read and see if it's terrible. I'll retract that. But it gives the feel of something that actually will become a kind of gay classic. It has blurbs from Salman Rushdie, Ariana Huffington, Armistead Maupin, Jonathan Capehart. So it's a tiny thing. These are all new arrivals, but as you can see, The Living Presidency, The Gospel According to Satan, Gay Like Me, that is 3 hours reading for me. So I'm going to be blazing through these. And then the last thing I want to show you, I will not be blazing through because it's quite big and quite ambitious as well. I think we saw it already. We saw an advanced copy, but I'll just in case that was last year. This is this year. This is by Sarah Kozloff, and this is A Queen in Hiding. A Queen in Hiding is book 1 of the 9 Realms Quartet. She's doing a fantasy quartet, a YA fantasy quartet. Let's see here, and it's her debut. So she sold a quartet as her debut. So hats off and golf clap to Sarah Kozloff, because that's no mean feat. What a way to burst on the literary scene. Let's see here. See, this is published by Tor, and Queen in Hiding comes out in late January. January 21st is the pub date. It's published by Tor and not Tor Teen. So once again, I'm getting the impression that this is going to be marketed as an adult fantasy quartet. It clearly is not. It is clearly YA. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's a lot wrong with hiding under false colors. So I'm not sure. Well, anyway, let me tell you a little bit about it here. In this first book, readers meet Cerulia, Princess of Wyrendale. When she and her mother are forced from the throne by unknown raiders, the two escape together, and Cerulia is moved to a modest home in a nearby village. Here she must grow up in disguise under an assumed name. The young queen must master the magic that is her birthright, become a ruthless guerrilla fighter, and transform into the queen she is destined to be to avenge her mother's death and wrest the stolen throne from a corrupt aristocracy whose rot has spread throughout her kingdom. And time is running out as the usurper leading searches for the missing princess under the impression that Cerulia is the last remaining threat to his power. With Queen in Hiding, Kozloff launches a gripping feminist coming-of-age tale set in a fully realized world of Enya Morn. Cerulia may be alone, but as the series progresses, she works with the spirits who play a role in mortal affairs and the animals she's able to communicate with to assemble an unlikely group of rebels, delivering a fresh, riveting fantasy series. And you can see it's a mother and her daughter. The parents die. There are no parents in the story. The child is the chosen one. The child is raised in pig pens. The child has a great destiny as soon as she graduates from high school, essentially, as soon as she graduates from high school. There'll be found family. There'll be misfits, one of whom will be a dreamy boy or a dreamy girl. And a large part of the storyline will be Bildungsroman. It will be the coming of age and the coming into romance of someone who, realistically speaking, has a huge amount of other things she should be paying attention to. That is YA. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, I'd be willing to bet this is going to be in the adult fantasy section of every new bookstore in the country. And it shouldn't be. Because there are going to be people... Well, anyway. So that is remarkable enough that this author is breaking into the literary world with a quartet. first thing. But it gets even more remarkable. The Nine Realms story gets even more remarkable. Those of you who follow YA, who follow this author, will know already what I'm going to show you, which is that this author broke into the literary market with a quartet that she'd already written. You look at that. She'd already written it. Tor bought the whole thing. And unlike with other fantasy series, they're bringing them out one book a month. So this comes out in January. Then the second one, let's see. The second one is The Queen of Raiders. That comes out in February. And then A Broken Queen comes out in March. And then The Cerulean Queen comes out in April. So you're gonna have the whole quartet will be done and available to read with no waiting and no eager, midnight launches before summer. That's pretty good. That's pretty ambitious. It makes me want. I will have to go and look and see if Sarah Kozlov has done interviews, because what I wouldn't give to talk to her about what it must have been like to be working on a quartet of books ahead of time. Did she work on them ahead of time, or did she pitch one while working on the others? Did it pour out of her? Did she have no control over getting all 4 books, the whole saga, done? This is thousands and thousands of words. I would love to know the genesis of this thing. The publishing idea on its own to publish all 4 books in successive months, that's fascinating. I don't know many examples of like that in publishing history in the 20th century or the 21st century. That's fascinating on its own, but I'd also mainly like to know how it was to write these things. I'll have to look for interviews online and see if maybe she says that. So anyway, those are your some new arrivals. We have Followers by Megan Angelo. This is a debut. So we have a lot of debuts in here. This is a debut. Naturally, you can tell from the title that it centers on social media. To some extent, it's half of it is probably going to be a social media style 1984, and if it's not good, I'm going to blame Britta. And then we have When We Were Vikings, another debut and another like Followers, and like A Queen in Hiding, the Nine Realms saga, seems to me to be YA flying under adult colors. I'll have to read them to see, but then we have 8 Days at Yalta, in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt, fresh from a squash game, joined Stalin and Churchill to negotiate the fate of the world. Then we have Gay Like Me. A gay father talks to his gay son about what it's like to live in gay America. Now, when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a book like that to his son about what it's like to be black in America, it became a rallying cry and a cult classic. I'll be interested to see if the same thing happens with this. Then The Gospel According to Satan. By Jared Wilson, a prolific religious writer who here hits on what I think is a golden idea, which is the things that fly under the guise of Christianity that are in fact anti-Christian. Can't wait to read it. Can't wait to see how much I agree with them, how much I disagree with them. Then we have The Living Presidency, about not only the state of engorged aggrandizement of the executive branch of the United States, but how to rein it in. What steps can be taken to rein it in. And lastly, the Nine Realms Quartet by Sarah Kozlov. All hats off to Sarah Kozlov. So we have Queen in Hiding, with very nice cover artwork, and then the subsequent 3 volumes, which will be coming out one a month until the whole quartet is done. So if you like A Queen in Hiding, you're not going to have to go through the usual agonies of marking the next book on your Amazon wish list and checking on it every month. No, it'll be here before you know. It'll be here before you've saved up the money for it. So there you go. Those are some new arrivals. We'll get to some package chewing in no time, I'm sure. In the meantime, this has gone hideously long, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.